Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Way Forward. This is a series of different webcasts where we discuss a variety of topics. This one today is about leadership. So we have the founder of The Way Forward, Chris Hughes, here to help dive in on some of these issues. And then we also have a couple other folks joining us today, which I'm particularly excited about. Very well versed in all things leadership. We have Dr. Clarence Green, who is the VP of Culture and the police chief at Northwest Missouri State. We also have Matt Baker, who is the Vice President of Student Affairs at Northwest Missouri State, amongst many other things that Chris is going to list off for their titles. They are very talented gentlemen, and we are very thankful to have them here today. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Chris to go ahead and kick this off.
Thanks, Molly. Appreciate it. And I appreciate Dr. Baker and Dr. Green for joining us today. So the whole purpose of this series that we're going to put together is to get outside of the stereotypical idea of that what we do at the Way Forward is all military centric. In fact, it is far from that. And we'll use aspects of the military leadership models and executive leadership team building aspects that myself and my team bring to the private and public sector, but also want to make sure that we are tapping into and leveraging the private sector, and in this particular case, individuals who have exemplified themselves in the world of higher education. I had the privilege of meeting these two gentlemen when I was working at Northwest Missouri State University, my alma mater, after getting out of the military after 35 years. And I actually met these gentlemen before, during, and have continued to have a relationship long after my departure from the university. Now, we're going to talk today to two university vice presidents, one of which who has been the interim president of the university for a year during a transitional period. So he's got a lot of interesting experience there as well. These two gentlemen come from very distinctly different paths to be where they are today, both sitting side by side as peers, as vice presidents of the university. But as you can see by Clarence's attire today, that Dr. Clarence Chief Green of the campus security is also a vice president of the University for Culture and Development. He's there, and while he was at the university as the police chief for the campus security, took it upon himself to continue to be an adult learner and go out and earn his doctoral degree while he was there operating within that environment. And it's a very interesting story, and I hope that he'll talk more about that today. Both of these leaders are very strong leaders, from my personal opinion, and they're respected, which is more important to me. They are both campus mentors and do a tremendous job working with not just their peers and their subordinates, but the students and the faculty. There's different pockets of leadership and leadership styles necessary on a university campus. So with that, I would like to start real quick with both of you, give our audience an idea. Now, Matt, you've been there for many, many years in many, many capacities, and you've grown up in the university, which is very different than the path that Clarence has used to get to the same position you are. So if you don't mind, Dr. Baker, Matt Baker, Vice President of Student Affairs, give us a little synopsis of yourself, sir. And don't forget to include that lovely wife of yours who teaches the institution as well.
Sure. Thanks, General. Thinking about my path at Northwest, I tell people that I came here for 3 years and I've accidentally stayed 30. I got one job offer leaving Kansas State University as an undergrad, and I became a hall director at Northwest. I had no plan on a career. I didn't know where I wanted to go. And after 2.5 years as a residence hall director, I decided I did want to work in student affairs. I did want to enjoy the campus life and the campus experience. From here, I ran down to the University of Arkansas for a few years, got a master's degree in higher education, and did a nationwide job search, and ended up back at Northwest. That wasn't the plan. By that time, I'd met my wife, Jill. We'd been married. We came back to Northwest, and we thought we'd be here 2 or 3 more years. So that's been about 27 years ago that we came back, 26 years ago, whatever it was. 3 kids, about 7 jobs, probably 40,000 students have been through here, still here going strong. So for the last 13 years, I've served as the Vice President of Student Affairs. I oversee much of the out-of-class experience, the residence halls, the food service plans, the counseling center, the clinic, the campus recreation, the Hughes Field House, no relation, the Title IX ADA, Greek life, campus spirit store, a lot of things outside the classroom that really make up the student experience. The thing I've become most passionate about is the interconnectedness of the student experience with their well-being and their ability to be retained and to graduate. You know, most campuses have a recreation program, have a Greek life program, have residence assistants, they have campus programming. I don't think everybody realizes how those are really designed to help students be connected, to help them find themselves, to help them grow. If somebody starts here on August 25th as a freshman and they're exactly the same when they graduate 4 years later on May 5th, we did it wrong. The campus experience should change you, it should challenge you, but it should do it with a spirit of support. And so my role here is to move pieces around to give students the absolute best experience they can have, both so they can be retained, but also so they can grow, become leaders themselves, and then make a difference in the world once they leave here.
Very good. Yeah. And we're going to get to all of those different challenges associated with that here in just a second, because you have some tremendous best practices and good ideas. And in some cases, I would call them workarounds from staying outside the organizational design. So good stuff. Dr. Green, please tell us, give us your quick rundown, sir.
Well, thank you, General Hughes, for that unbelievable introduction, but also thank you for this opportunity just to share on the way forward today. My path is a little bit untraditional. I started in juvenile corrections, working for a company that helped transport juveniles to lockable facilities. Then I moved to a municipal law enforcement department for a couple of years before coming on to the university and working through that setting. And I worked my way up through the ranks from a sergeant all the way up to the chief. Then it led to other opportunities by seeking additional education, as well as seeking some professional development opportunities. I've served as the interim vice president of human resources, which gave me a lot of experience. And then I've also served as the interim vice president of diversity, equity, inclusion, which gave me another layer of experience. And then I went back and completed a terminal degree, and it allowed me an opportunity to serve as the president in the interim role last year for the institution, which provided me a lot of learning and a lot of opportunity. I've truly been blessed by all of those experiences, and I think they've helped me build a career of nearly 28 years here at Northwest.
So there's two things, and thank you, Dr. Green. There's two things for each of you, and I'm gonna see who goes first here. Feel free to jump on this as quick as you want, but both of you did something to me that was just unbelievably impressive. Something that, you kind of get old and jaded like myself. You go, I've seen that before. I've seen it before. It's common. But both of you did something that to me was uncommon. Of course, for you, Dr. Green, it was to epitomize an adult learner, and in a higher education environment. I'm really curious what motivated you to pursue the terminal degree. What was it? Was it vindictive? Was it a true belief in education? Was it you wanted to increase opportunities? But I'm curious about that because there's a lot of people who are senior in their years, or senior in their professions, who don't even consider that as an option. So I'd like you to address that in a second. And Dr. Baker, I want everybody here to know that, when I was the commanding general at Fort Knox, I ran into you at Northwest, which is my alma mater, and you said to me, I want to learn more. I want to be a better leader. And you'd already at that point had like 10 years as a vice president of student affairs in the institution. One would consider you a seasoned leader, but you looked at me and said, I want to learn more. And you actually volunteered, you and your wife, Jill, came to Fort Knox, Kentucky as our guests and spent a week looking at the installation, looking how an Army base, which is kind of similar in design to a university campus, figure out what could you steal, what kind of good ideas could you take back to make your institution better. And so those were two things that just make the two of you pop. So I'm going to step back and let you both argue over who's going to talk about that first, if at all.
I'll just jump right in. And me and Dr. Baker work together a ton. We've done a ton of hosting of different events and things together. And so I think we'll play off each other very well, but I'll go ahead and kick it off if that's okay. It all starts with me with my why and my purpose. Two parts of my why and purpose is to be a person of understanding, which means I have to constantly learn. The second part of my why and purpose is to always help people and organizations achieve beyond what they believe is possible. And so, how that intersects to me of why I went and got that terminal degree, I've hired two leaders who report to me in the police realm, and one of them that reports to me in the IR realm. Then I have another one that reports to me in the HR realm. I felt like all of those individuals are extremely sharp. They understand their work at a deep level, and they challenge me. And they were challenging me beyond what I felt my capabilities were. And so I felt needing to, with that first principle of my purpose and why, to be a lifelong learner, I had to get sharper at my skills because I'm also charged with that second principle of how do I help them achieve beyond what they're possible without me knowing new concepts and new ideas. And so it was important for me to get back in that classroom to learn more in a different setting. And this is not like your typical, like our paths are a little bit similar, General Hughes, where we're used to learning and training in an environment that may be a little bit more intense than the educational environment because of the accountabilities that we have and that they're teaching on us in those training labs that we're typically experiencing. But in the education lab where I was at, I was learning with folks who work primarily in secondary education and those that work in higher education, and the thinking is different. So it was extremely challenging for me, but it allowed me to understand at a deeper level and learn a lot more about processes, about using frameworks, problem solving methodologies that I can bring back and help challenge those that I'm charged with leading and essentially help the organization. So that was really my purpose of getting that terminal degree.
Well, look, so you didn't mention anything about job security and getting promoted, which is fascinating because when I work with youth and do mid-level management counseling and mentoring, it's always seems to be the motivation is to get a better job, to get hired at a higher salary rate. It's, you know, to make more money, which seems to be the motivator, which is a civilian sector motivator and also kind of a seal of or a representation of how well you're doing as opposed to what kind of impact you might be having. So it's refreshing to hear that you did it to challenge yourself. But real quick, I want to pull in the thread, a person of understanding. Define that for me.
It's more about being learned. I want to have I want to be able to have a deep understanding of concepts, problems that we're charged with solving. And sometimes, you know, I have a lot of tacit knowledge or I'm using my experiences, which are filled with a lot of bias. And
Yeah.
so I really want to know deeply and have some sort of a process to help me seek that understanding. And what I've learned by using processes or problem solving methodologies is help when you're dealing with a lot of teams. And typically, when I'm doing my work, I'm working with teams. And so, if we all have the same methodology that we're using, it helps us get to the same path. Therefore, someone's not worried about my experiences influencing that or my rank. I want to truly get there together so that we can build something fascinating because the best things we've done are always been team based. And so most of my work is going to be in a team based scenario. And I want to be able to understand deeply, help others understand deeply. And part of understanding for me also, I can go on for days, it's about this theory around sense making. And you know, and that was kind of developed after that fire at Van Gogh. You know, and so I'm always trying to figure out ways of how do you make sense of things in a rapidly moving environment such as policing. So when you're dealing with someone on the street, how do you make sense of a person or a situation so that you can have the right outcome? And so that's what understanding means to me.
And you know, I love the word understanding because of understand, visualize, and describe from the executive leadership
Oh,
model
perfect.
we talked about. And you've also brought up another topic we'll hit here in a second, which is standardized decision-making processes that help you take bias and emotion out of decision making and then only add them in if in fact you decide to do so as a group. So great points all. Dr. Baker, why in the world would you and your wife spend valuable vacation time at Fort Knox, Kentucky?
Well, don't tell anybody, but I don't think I took vacation for that. I considered it a work trip, so it was totally fine. So it's kind of hard to believe that it's probably been 6 or 7, maybe 7 years ago that we came down there, a couple of years before your retirement. And it's hard to think about what the environment of higher education was in the spring of 2017, when I think this was. Uh, it's pre-pandemic, but what I remember is there was a lot of talk within the higher education sector that there's a demographic cliff coming, that the number of college-bound students will be decreasing. And that's knowable because we know how many kids were born 18 years ago. And so in 20 years, we know who's going to be eligible to come to college as a traditional age. At the time, the state had expectations for performance metrics. We had to perform in 5 different categories in order to receive new funding. Um, I like history, and I think about what I think is known as the Jeffersonian model of American public higher education, and it largely hasn't changed since Thomas Jefferson helped design it hundreds of years ago. And so we have leaders in higher ed, and for better or for worse, we have leaders who know how to lead in higher ed. But higher education, as we knew at the time, and is even more true now than it was then, higher ed is changing in ways we cannot project, we cannot predict, and we don't know what's going to happen. And it seemed to me that it would be short-sighted to try to lead a changing industry in a way that had been led for the previous 100, 150, 200 years and expect a different result. I think one of the first conversations you and I had was about trying to figure out how do we lead differently to get a different result in an entrenched organization, an entrenched culture. Higher education is a very entrenched culture, and it's going to take leaders who are willing to A, think outside the box, but B, bring people along to think outside the box. It is much easier to go along to get along. It is much easier to say, man, it worked in the 1980s and 90s. It'll probably work now. But I think, to Clarence's point of being a knowledgeable person, it's probably pretty obvious that that's not going to work. And so the idea was, I'd love to learn from something different, somebody different. I'm afraid that the way higher ed has been led for 50 years isn't going to work in 20 years. And I don't want to wait till we hit the cliff and then begin to start figuring out what we should do. And so it was, my motivation really was about trying to be a better leader and get insight from somewhere else. We've, as Dr. Green mentioned, he and I've worked together a long time. We've been into a lot of weird situations together. But he and I have talked, and he shared with me some studies years and years ago. I think they're called the Deloitte studies, about the value of diverse teams and the decisions that diverse teams make. And when you have 8 or 10 learned people in a room making decisions about higher ed, and they all have 30 years of experience in higher ed, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a similar decision that was made 30 years ago. And so just kind of believing that we would be better off to have a broader perspective, or a broader toolbox, a deeper toolbox, to look at how could we look at this differently, and how could we be prepared for the demographic cliff. Who knew that 3 years later the world would shut down with the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of that learning and that ability to be more agile came into play. It paid off to have at least begun to thought about new and better ways of thinking, or at least different ways of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I think, for me, the motivation for me to invite you, there was multiple reasons in reality, but the first one is when someone comes up to you, especially if you don't know anything about the environment that they come from. I mean, just because I went to college doesn't mean I know anything about higher ed. Just because I did provost work at a university in the Army doesn't mean I know anything about a civilian university. And so it's that empathy of, or at least the humbleness to be able to say, and the vulnerability to go, I can't answer your question. When you're asking me a leadership question that is in the realm of higher education, it's almost blasphemous for me to say, oh, this is exactly how you should do it. And if I remember the conversation, it was a day-long conversation, which was your frustration of the institution in terms of how you ran the mechanics of everything around the higher educational component. All those things you listed at the beginning. And it was when you explained those to me, I kept connecting the dots to Fort Knox, which is essentially a place that does similar activities to what Student Affairs does for its families. It generates its own power. It has its own office spaces, it has its own cleaning teams, it has its own gymnasiums, it has its own dining facilities. Guess what? They're all very similar in activity and design, but they were led very differently and they were funded very differently, which is a very different way to go about approaching problem solving. So for me, the lesson was, don't leave Matt a pile of slides and say, mission accomplished, I taught him leadership and it's going to help him and walk away. It was, what, sometimes you have to follow through with the empathetic idea that you don't know what you don't know with that person. And I think that was what was fun for me, was watching you, and your wife came because she also does secondary education and she spent time at military schools, which are run very differently, but have the same outcomes at the end. So I thought that was very profound that you took the time to do that. I'm glad you charged the university. You should have charged the university for it, but it was great. It was great because I got to meet both of you guys. And I appreciate both of you coming in today. I hope that you both be willing to come back because I think we'll have some good feedback on this, and we definitely want you guys to come back and keep talking to us. Fair enough?
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And I'm going to leave again saying that I was the only one that wore the Northwest Missouri State University colors to represent today.
Right on.
Have a great day, guys. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you.